I didn't know my marriage would end in a therapist's office, under soft lamplight, a box of tissues on the table, and my own hands folded so tightly my nails left crescent marks in my palms. It wasn't a screaming fight. It wasn't a flying plate or a slammed door. It was one sentence, delivered like a technicality. "We never said I couldn't," my husband said, leaning back as if we were discussing a parking rule. "We were separated." I blinked at him, then at Dr. Evans, then back at him, because I kept waiting for the punchline, the moment he'd soften, admit he was scared, say he'd made a mistake. But his eyes didn't flinch. "6," he added, like he was reading a number off a grocery receipt. 6 different women. The room went quiet in that way that makes your hearing sharpen. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the scratch of Dr. Evans's pen stopping mid-note, my own breath catching, like it couldn't decide whether to become a sob or a laugh. I heard my voice before I felt it. Thin, careful. 6, while I was in therapy, trying to fix us. He lifted a shoulder, half shrug, half dismissal. "You were free to do it too." I tasted metal. My heartbeat slammed once, hard, like a fist against a door. I remembered the day I packed my suitcase in our apartment, tape in my hand, my whole life laid out in cardboard boxes. I had asked him, quietly, politely, what the rules were, what this trial separation meant. He'd snapped at me then, angry that I'd even asked. He'd said if dating was the first thing on my mind, maybe saving the marriage wasn't worth it. He'd made me feel dirty for needing clarity. And I, exhausted from night shifts, desperate not to lose him, had apologized. Now, in that office, he stared at me like I was the one being unreasonable for looking shattered. Dr. Evans said my name once, gently, like she was trying to pull me back into my body. But I wasn't there anymore. I was watching the past year rearrange itself in my mind. Every quiet night alone in a hotel room, every therapy session, every "I'm working on myself," every hope I carried like a fragile glass. And then my husband tilted his head and said almost impatiently, "It was allowed. You could have 2. That's when something inside me went very still. Not numb. Clear. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. Hidden behind ambiguity, defended with logic, and delivered with a face that expected me to accept it. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that I was already walking out. I'm 39 now, but when I think back to the beginning of Mark and me, back before our marriage became a series of carefully worded sentences, I remember how simple everything felt. We met in our late 20s, through a mutual friend at a small rooftop gathering downtown. It wasn't romantic the way movies make it look. No lightning strike, no slow-motion eye contact across a crowded room. It was the fact that he listened. I was talking about work, marketing campaigns, client demands, the endless pressure to be on and likable, and he didn't try to outtalk me. He asked questions. He smiled like he actually cared about the answer. Later, when the night cooled and people started drifting toward the elevators, he walked me to my car and said, "I like the way your brain works." That sentence stayed with me. Mark worked in overnight logistics for a regional hospital network. Even then, the schedule sounded brutal, 10 o'clock p.m. to 7 a.m., but he spoke about it with pride. Not ego, exactly. More like responsibility, like he believed being reliable was a form of love. I fell for that. I fell for the steadiness, the way he remembered small things, the way he offered solutions when I was overwhelmed but didn't make me feel weak for needing them. When we moved in together, our tiny 2-bedroom apartment felt like a starter version of forever. Secondhand furniture, cheap plates, a mismatched set of towels, and the quiet confidence that we'd build the rest as we went. We got married after a few years. No dramatic objections, no big family feud, just friends, warm speeches, and the kind of hopeful exhaustion that comes with believing you've made the right choice. For a long time, I thought I had. Then March 2020 hit, and everything changed. Not overnight, but like water rising slowly until one day you realize the furniture is floating. My company went fully remote. Suddenly, our apartment wasn't just home. It was my office, my meeting room, my creative studio, my entire world from 9 a.m. to evening. Mark was still on nights. He'd come home at sunrise, eyes shadowed, shoulders tight, smelling faintly of hospital-grade disinfectant and coffee. He needed to sleep during the day. I needed to work. At first, I tried. I really did. I kept my voice down. I moved my desk away from the wall we shared with the bedroom. I bought a rug to soften sound. But marketing isn't quiet work. Calls are loud. Brainstorming sessions are chaotic. Clients demand energy, enthusiasm, sometimes the kind that feels performative even when you're alone in your own living room. And Mark, sleep deprived, started to fray. It wasn't the big fights at first. It was the micro frictions. The look he'd give me when he came out of the bedroom, blinking like the light hurt. The way he'd pause in the hallway and listen, jaw clenched, before retreating. The way I started to resent how his exhaustion seemed to dictate the emotional temperature of our home. One of the first real cracks happened over something stupid, my blender. I had a smoothie habit, 1 p.m., every day. It was my little anchor, my ritual between meetings. The day he snapped, I hadn't even thought about it. I hit the button, the motor roared, and then I heard the bedroom door slam so hard a picture frame in the hallway fell and cracked. I froze, hand still on the blender lid, stomach dropping. When he came out, his face was tight and pale. He didn't yell. That almost would have been easier. He just pointed at the wall, our shared wall, and went back into the bedroom like I was something he couldn't bear to look at. I didn't apologize that day. Not because I didn't care, because I felt backed into a corner too. And that became our pattern. He needed quiet. I needed space to exist. He felt unseen. I felt controlled. We both started acting like the other person was choosing to hurt us, instead of simply failing to cope. By spring and summer of 2023, the strain had hardened into something familiar and ugly. Our dinners became silent. Our conversations became transactional. Our affection felt like a memory we kept touching to prove it still existed. And then one evening in late June, Mark said the words that sounded reasonable on the surface. Maybe we should do a trial separation. He said it like it was a reset button. Like space would make us kinder. Like distance would make us want each other again. I didn't want it, but I was tired. And when you're tired enough, you start confusing not fighting with being okay. So I nodded. And I didn't realize I'd just stepped into the part of the story where every unclear sentence would become a weapon. The separation didn't start with distance. It started with rules that were never fully spoken, and silences that carried more weight than answers. The hospital arranged temporary housing for Mark, an extended stay hotel not far from the network's central facility. It made sense logistically. It also made the separation feel clinical, like a work assignment instead of the slow unthreading of a marriage. The night before he moved out, our apartment was half-packed, boxes stacked against the walls, our life reduced to labeled cardboard, books, kitchen, clothes, winter. I remember standing in the living room with a roll of tape in my hand, watching him fold shirts with precise movements, like if he stayed neat enough, this wouldn't hurt. That's when I asked. Not accusing, not emotional, just careful. So, I said, keeping my voice level, what does this mean about seeing other people? He stopped folding. Slowly he straightened, turned away from me, and crossed his arms. His jaw tightened, the way it did when he felt attacked, even if no one had raised their voice. If that's the first thing on your mind, he snapped, maybe saving the marriage isn't worth it. The words hit harder than I expected. Shame rose fast and hot in my chest. I felt like I'd revealed something ugly about myself, like I'd admitted to wanting an escape instead of clarity. That's not what I meant, I said quickly. I just want to understand the boundaries, so we're on the same page. He shook his head, already turning away. I want to focus on fixing things, not turning this into an excuse to mess around. He didn't say no, but his anger made it feel like the question itself was inappropriate. So I apologized. I told him I wasn't planning to date, that I wanted us to work, that therapy and space might help us reset. He gave a short nod, grabbed another shirt, and the conversation ended. Not resolved, just buried. Looking back, that moment planted the seed. Because what I took from it, what I genuinely believed, was that dating other people was off the table. Not because we signed a contract, but because his reaction made it clear that even asking made me the bad guy. The next day, he moved into the hotel. At first, the quiet felt strange. The apartment echoed without his presence. I caught myself lowering my voice during calls even though no one was sleeping down the hall anymore. Then, gradually, I stopped. Mark started therapy almost immediately. He told me about it in a brief text. Found a therapist through work, starting next week. I replied with encouragement. I meant it. I didn't start therapy right away. I told myself I was coping fine. Work kept me busy. The apartment felt calmer without constant tension. I filled my days with meetings, deadlines, projects, noise that drowned out reflection. Our contact became minimal, logistics only, bills, mail, the occasional check-in that read more like a status update than a conversation. He didn't ask what I was doing with my time. I didn't volunteer. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, where I noticed the shift. When he mentioned feeling clearer, more rested. When he said therapy was helping him understand his anger and communication patterns. When he told me, months later, that he was working toward switching to a day shift. I was proud of him. I was also distant. Because while he was doing the work out loud, I was doing something quieter, something I didn't frame as wrong at the time. I told myself we were separated. I told myself we hadn't set explicit rules. I told myself I wasn't cheating, I was surviving. And each time I made that choice, I relied on the same technicality. He never said I couldn't. By the time we agreed to start couples counseling in early 2024, I had already built an internal version of events where I wasn't the one who crossed a line. I was just someone who interpreted ambiguity differently. I didn't realize then that ambiguity doesn't disappear in therapy. It waits, and then it detonates, right when you're trying to rebuild trust. Couples counseling began with the illusion of safety. The office was warm and neutral, soft gray walls, two identical armchairs, angled toward a small couch, a low table with a box of tissues that looked untouched, like a prop no one wanted to admit they might need. Dr. Evans had a calm presence, the kind that made you feel like nothing you said would shock her. For the first few sessions, it almost worked. Mark talked about his night shifts, the way sleep deprivation had hollowed him out, how everything felt louder, sharper, more unbearable than it should have. He owned his irritability. He used the language therapy had given him. I felt overwhelmed. I shut down instead of communicating. I can see how that hurt you. I listened. I nodded. I acknowledged my part too. I talked about feeling boxed in, about how the apartment had become a pressure cooker. I admitted I hadn't always been considerate about noise, that I'd minimized how desperate he was for rest. I framed it as two people trapped in circumstances neither of us knew how to navigate. Dr. Evans guided us gently, pointing out patterns. Mark bottled things up until he exploded. I deflected, gave partial answers, softened edges, avoided direct confrontation when I felt accused. She called it diplomacy. Mark called it weasel words. We even laughed about it once. By late summer of 2024, we were talking about logistics, how he might move back in, what boundaries would look like, how to protect the progress we'd made. I could feel him leaning toward hope again, toward us. Then came the session in early September. Dr. Evans shifted in her chair, glanced at her notes, and said, "Before we talk about reunification, there's one thing we need to clarify. During the separation, were there any outside relationships that need to be formally closed?" She looked at Mark first. He didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "I didn't date anyone. We agreed the separation was about working on ourselves." I felt a flicker of irritation, not at him, but at the way he framed it as an agreement. Before I could stop myself, I cut in. "We never actually established that as a rule." The words landed harder than I intended. Mark turned toward me slowly, confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I asked you before I moved out." I crossed my arms, mirroring a posture I'd taken so many times before, defensive without admitting it. "You asked what the focus was. I said I wanted to fix the marriage. That doesn't mean dating was forbidden." The room went very still. Dr. Evans's pen paused midair. Mark stared at me like I'd just spoken a different language. "You got angry," he said. "You shut the conversation down. You made it clear dating wasn't okay." "I made it clear it shouldn't be the focus," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He shook his head slowly like he was trying to realign reality. Did you see anyone?" I could have softened it then. I could have said a few dates. I could have said it didn't mean anything. I could have framed it as loneliness, confusion, a mistake. Instead, I answered with precision. "Yes." His throat worked. "How many?" "6. The word hung there, heavy and exact. I added, because clarity suddenly mattered to me more than kindness. Over the year. Mark's face drained of color. He looked at Dr. Evans like she might interrupt, correct me, say I'd misunderstood the question. She didn't. "You slept with 6 men," he said quietly. "Yes. While I was in therapy," I exhaled. "We were separated." The silence that followed was so complete it felt physical, like pressure against my ears. Mark's hands clenched on his knees. I could see his pulse jumping in his neck. "You said you wanted to save the marriage," he said. "I did." "And you thought this was allowed?" I leaned back, heart pounding now, irritation creeping in. "You could have done the same." That's when his eyes changed. Not angry, not loud, just clear. "I wasn't asking for a permission to sleep around," he said. "I was asking for honesty." Dr. Evans said my name softly, a warning wrapped in concern. Mark stood up. The chair legs scraped against the floor, sharp in the quiet. He looked at me once, really looked at me, and I felt something shift. Not explode. Collapse. This changes things, he said, voice steady. I need time to reconsider whether there's anything left to move back to. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain intent versus interpretation, technicality versus expectation. But he was already walking toward the door. As he reached for the handle, I heard myself say, sharp with frustration, "You're overreacting." He didn't turn around. And in that moment, as the door closed behind him, I felt the first real crack of fear, not because he was leaving the room, but because I wasn't sure he was coming back at all. The door closing behind Mark didn't echo. That was the strangest part. I had expected a slam, something dramatic enough to justify the spike of adrenaline flooding my body. But the sound was soft, almost polite, like the end of a meeting that ran over time. The kind of ending that pretends nothing irreversible just happened. I sat there for a few seconds too long, staring at the empty space where he'd been standing. My legs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Dr. Evans said my name again, gently this time, and I realized I hadn't breathed properly since I'd said the number out loud. 6. Hearing it spoken back to me, "You slept with 6 men," made it sound larger than it had felt when it was happening. When it was just nights, bodies, moments I filed away as separate from my marriage. "I didn't mean to hurt him," I said finally, my voice thinner than I expected. Dr. Evans didn't argue. She didn't comfort me either. She asked carefully, "What did you think he would feel when he found out?" The question landed uncomfortably close to the truth. I thought he'd understand," I said. "That he'd see it wasn't about replacing him. That it was just life continuing while we were apart." She nodded slowly. "Did you ever tell him?" "No." "Why not?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Because every answer sounded worse when said aloud. Because part of me knew he wouldn't be okay with it. Because it was easier to rely on ambiguity than risk confrontation. Because if I didn't say it, it stayed theoretical. I left the office alone. The drive home blurred into red lights and familiar turns I barely registered. When I unlocked the apartment door, the quiet felt different than it had during the separation. No longer peaceful, just hollow. I sank onto the couch and replayed the past year in fragments. Mark in the hotel room, telling me therapy was helping. Mark switching to day shift, proud and hopeful. Mark saying he was working on his anger, his communication, his sleep. And me, telling myself I was allowed to compartmentalize. That separation meant autonomy. That I wasn't obligated to disclose what he hadn't explicitly forbidden. The justifications that had felt airtight before now sounded defensive. I checked my phone. No messages. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from guilt exactly, but from a restless need to organize the narrative in my head. I rehearsed explanations, clarifications, the exact wording I'd use when we talked again. I wasn't cheating. We were separated. You never said we couldn't. Each sentence felt technically correct and emotionally hollow. The next morning, I texted him. "Can we talk?" Hours passed. I oscillated between anger and panic. Anger that he'd walked out without hearing me fully. Panic that I'd misjudged how fragile the thread between us really was. When he finally responded, it wasn't with a time or a place. It was one line. "I need space." I told myself that was reasonable, that I'd asked for space too, once. But this felt different. This wasn't logistical. This was emotional distance hardening into something else. Over the next few days, silence stretched. No updates, no reassurance, just the knowledge that he was somewhere else, reevaluating a year of effort through a lens I'd shattered in one sentence. I started questioning myself in a way I hadn't before. Had I been dishonest or just imprecise? Was it fair to hold me accountable for assumptions he made? Or was I hiding behind technicalities because facing the emotional truth was harder? I remembered his face in the office, not angry, not loud, just resolved. That scared me more than any argument ever had. A week later, Dr. Evans called me. Her voice was hesitant, careful in a way that made my stomach tighten before she even said anything meaningful. She asked how I was doing. I gave a vague answer. She paused, then said she wanted to be transparent. She was concerned. Not about the marriage. About Mark. She told me, without betraying confidences, that she'd observed a pattern in our sessions, that Mark had done deep, uncomfortable work, that I had, in many ways, remained protected by ambiguity, that returning to the marriage without radical honesty from both sides could undo his progress. "I don't say this lightly," she said, But reconciliation requires symmetry. Right now, I don't see that. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the grain in the wood. For the first time, I considered the possibility that this wasn't about miscommunication. That maybe, despite all my explanations, I had crossed a line I couldn't redefine my way back over. And beneath all the rationalizations, a quieter thought surfaced, unwelcome and sharp. If our positions were reversed, if I'd spent a year working on myself while he slept with 6 women, would I really be able to forgive it? I didn't like the answer. When Mark finally agreed to meet me, it wasn't at our apartment. It was a coffee shop halfway between my place and his new one-bedroom across town, the kind of neutral territory people choose when they already know how a conversation is going to end, but still want to pretend there's room for negotiation. I arrived early, chose a table near the window, wrapped my hands around a mug I didn't really want. Every few minutes, I checked the door. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, but because the softness I used to rely on wasn't there anymore. He sat across from me without leaning in, no reaching for my hand, no familiar half-smile. "How are you?" I asked. "I'm steady," he said. "Not cold, not warm, just factual." I launched into what I'd rehearsed, about ambiguity, about how separation meant different things to different people, about how I never intended to replace him or disrespect the work he was doing. He listened without interrupting. That should have reassured me. It didn't. When I finished, he said quietly, "You keep explaining the rules. I'm talking about trust." I bristled. "I didn't lie." "You omitted," he replied, "and you knew why." That sentence hit closer than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, but he continued. "I spent a year believing we were both putting the marriage on pause, not shopping around. I wasn't waiting for perfection. I was waiting for honesty." Something sharp rose in my chest. "So what? I'm the villain now?" "No," he said. "You're just not the partner I thought I was working toward." The escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers. Over the next weeks, conversations that might have once brought us closer only widened the gap. Every attempt I made to frame my actions as technically permissible collided with his need for emotional clarity. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't punishing me. He was withdrawing consent from reconciliation, from hope, from the shared future we'd been tiptoeing back toward. Friends started noticing. My sister asked why Mark wasn't coming to things anymore. A coworker mentioned seeing him look lighter when she ran into him downtown. I caught myself resenting that, resenting the idea that he might be thriving without me while I was stuck defending decisions I could no longer fully stand behind. Then came the family pressure. His parents, who had always kept a polite distance, suddenly reached out to him, not to mediate, not to reconcile, to support. I found out later that his mother had said, "You did everything you could. Don't go back to something that makes you smaller." That sentence lodged under my skin like a splinter. I tried one last angle. During a phone call that stretched late into the night, I asked him directly what he wanted from me. "What would make this right?" I said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know that there is a right anymore," he said. "I think there's just an ending I can live with." Panic surged. "So that's it? 8 years and you're just done?" He exhaled slowly. "I didn't become done overnight. I became done the moment I realized I was the only one protecting the spirit of what we said instead of the loopholes." I accused him, then, of rigidity, of expecting mind reading, of punishing me retroactively for something he never explicitly banned. He didn't take the bait. "That's the problem," he said. "You're still arguing definitions. I'm talking about values." The escalation reached its peak when he told me, calmly, carefully, that he was filing for divorce. I felt the floor drop out from under me. At first, I tried tears, then logic, then bargaining. I offered compromises that should have embarrassed me the moment they left my mouth. "If it makes it even," I said, voice cracking, "you can sleep with other people. I won't stop you." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "That's not healing," he said finally. "That's bookkeeping." I heard it then, the exhaustion in his voice, not anger, not revenge. Relief. That terrified me. He wasn't walking away wounded and dramatic. He was walking away resolved. The papers arrived a few days later. Seeing my name and his on opposite sides of a legal document made everything suddenly real in a way therapy sessions never had. This wasn't about perspective anymore. It was about consequences. We shifted to communicating through lawyers. Brief, efficient, distant. I moved through my days on autopilot, meetings, emails, routines, while my nights filled with questions I could no longer ask him. Was I wrong? Or just incompatible with the kind of clarity he needed? I replayed that moment before the separation again and again, the tape in my hand, the boxes, the question I'd asked, the anger in his response. I had taken his discomfort as permission to avoid clarity. And now, clarity was exactly what cost me everything. By the time the escalation slowed, by the time there was nothing left to argue, no ground left to reclaim, I wasn't fighting to save the marriage anymore. I was fighting the realization that sometimes you can follow the letter of an agreement and still betray its heart. The darkest moment didn't come when the divorce papers arrived. It came later, quiet, ordinary, humiliating in its simplicity. It came the night I realized there was no one left to argue with. The apartment was clean in the way spaces get when you're avoiding your own thoughts. Dishes done, counters wiped, laundry folded with mechanical precision. I moved from room to room like I was staging the place for someone else's life. Mark's side of the closet was empty now. Not dramatically stripped, just gone. Empty hangers, still spaced the way he used to keep them. I touched one without thinking, felt it sway slightly, and something in my chest folded inward. For months, I had told myself this was a misunderstanding that escalated too far, a communication failure, a technical disagreement, a clash of definitions. But standing there alone, I couldn't hide behind language anymore, because misunderstandings can be repaired. This couldn't. I sat on the floor of the bedroom with my back against the bed, knees pulled to my chest. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. It forced memories forward without asking permission. Mark packing. Mark in therapy. Mark changing his entire schedule. Mark believing, genuinely, that we were both pausing the world to save what we had. And me, telling myself that separation meant freedom from accountability. I tried to reconstruct my logic again, one last time. I hadn't cheated, we were separated, he never said don't. But the words sounded brittle now, like glass tapped too many times. What I had never said out loud, what I hadn't even admitted to myself, was the part that mattered most. I didn't want to risk him saying no, because if I had asked again, clearly, calmly, "Are we allowed to see other people?" he would have answered. And I knew what the answer would have been. So I let anger do the talking for me that day. I let his discomfort shut the door so I wouldn't have to open it myself. That realization hit harder than any accusation he'd thrown at me, because it meant this wasn't just about ambiguity. It was about avoidance. I cried then. Not the cinematic kind. The quiet, gulping kind that leaves your throat sore and your eyes swollen. The kind that comes when you're no longer trying to win. I cried for the version of myself who thought technical correctness was safety. I cried for the woman who confused autonomy with honesty. I cried because I could finally see the shape of the loss, and it was my own making as much as his boundary. The next morning, I woke up with that hollow exhaustion that comes after grief drains you dry. No dramatic resolve, no empowerment montage. Just wait. At work, I stared at my screen and couldn't remember what I'd opened the file for. A colleague asked if I was okay. I smiled automatically and said, "Just tired." That became my default response. At night, I scrolled through old photos I shouldn't have looked at. Us on vacation, us at weddings, us on the couch, comfortable and unguarded. I noticed something I hadn't before. In the later photos, the ones closer to the separation, Mark was still leaning in. I wasn't. That realization sat heavy in my stomach. The worst part of the dark moment wasn't loneliness. It was clarity arriving too late. Because clarity, when it comes early, saves relationships. When it comes late, it just explains why they couldn't survive. I stopped trying to reach him after that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I finally understood that my explanations were no longer acts of love. They were attempts to soothe my own guilt. And he deserved better than that. So I sat with the silence, with the knowledge that I hadn't been betrayed. I had been outgrown. With the understanding that sometimes the deepest loss isn't losing someone who hurt you. It's losing someone who did the work, while you hid behind permission you never truly had. That was the night I stopped asking how to fix us, and started asking who I was without the story I'd told myself. The turning point didn't arrive with fireworks or sudden confidence. It arrived quietly, on a weekday morning, standing in my kitchen, holding a mug I'd reheated twice, and still forgotten to drink. I realized I wasn't waiting for Mark to come back anymore. That thought startled me more than anything else had. For weeks, even after the papers, even after the silence, some part of me had been suspended, like if I stayed still enough, didn't fully accept the ending, something might rewind. A call, a message, a reconsideration. But that morning, I noticed something different. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't rehearsing arguments. I wasn't preparing explanations no one had asked for. I was just there. And in that stillness, a harder truth surfaced, one I couldn't dodge with language or logic. Mark didn't leave because I slept with 6 men. He left because when honesty mattered most, I chose defensiveness over clarity. That distinction mattered because it meant the work I needed to do wasn't about justifying my past. It was about changing my future. I booked my own therapy appointment that day. Not couples therapy, not reconciliation therapy. Mine. In that first session, I told the story the way I'd always told it. Measured, careful, technically accurate. Halfway through, the therapist asked a simple question. What were you afraid would happen if you were completely honest? The answer came before I could filter it. He'd say no. Saying it out loud loosened something in my chest. I hadn't been confused. I had been afraid. Afraid that if I asked clearly, I'd be bound by the answer. Afraid that choosing the marriage explicitly would mean giving up autonomy. I wasn't ready to surrender. Afraid that being direct would force a choice I wanted to postpone. Ambiguity had been my shield, and it had cost me everything I claimed to be protecting. That realization didn't excuse my actions, but it reframed them, not as villainy, not as innocence, as avoidance. Over the next weeks, I stopped narrating myself as the wrong party in a misunderstanding and started owning my part in a breach of trust that didn't require infidelity to be real. I wrote Mark a letter. Not to send, just to say the things I hadn't said without conditions or defenses. I wrote that I was sorry, not for sleeping with other people, but for letting him believe we were aligned when we weren't, for allowing anger to substitute for clarity, for choosing silence when honesty would have been harder but kinder. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't ask for reconciliation. I folded the letter and put it away, because the turning point wasn't about him anymore. It was about the version of myself I was done being. I stopped calling the separation mutual growth in my head and started calling it what it was. Two people responding very differently to the same rupture. One confronting his patterns directly, one skirting the edges of responsibility. That didn't make me irredeemable. It made me accountable. I began rebuilding my life without trying to preserve the image of who I thought I was. I rearranged the apartment, not to erase him, but to stop pretending the space was temporary. I made decisions without wondering how he'd feel about them. For the first time in a long while, my choices didn't need a loophole. They just needed to be mine. And that's when something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not because I'd won or justified myself, but because I'd stopped arguing with reality. The marriage was over. The story I told myself about being technically right was over. What remained was simpler and harder. Learning how to speak plainly, even when the answer scares me. Learning that clarity isn't cruelty. Learning that freedom without honesty is just loneliness in better lighting. That was the moment I stopped waiting for closure from him and started building it myself. The fallout didn't explode. It settled. Slowly, deliberately, like dust after a building comes down. Quiet enough that people assume nothing serious happened, even though the structure is gone. The divorce moved forward with a professionalism that felt almost cruel in its efficiency. No screaming matches in lawyers' offices. No dramatic standoffs over possessions. Just forms, signatures, timelines. Mark didn't fight me. That was the part that hurt more than if he had. He agreed to most of the asset division without argument. The apartment equity was split cleanly. Savings divided. Furniture categorized like inventory instead of memories. When we sat across from each other during mediation, we barely made eye contact. We spoke only when necessary, voices flat, cooperative. At one point, the mediator asked if there were any items of sentimental value we needed to discuss. Mark shook his head. She can have whatever she wants. I felt something sharp lodge behind my ribs, because indifference cuts deeper than anger ever could. When he moved fully into his new apartment, I heard about it through someone else. A mutual friend mentioned it casually. He's really settled in. Seems good. Good. That word echoed in my head for days. At work, my life looked unchanged. I still ran campaigns, still joined calls, still smiled on camera. But people noticed the difference in the pauses, how I took longer to answer personal questions, how I redirected conversations that drifted toward relationships. My family asked careful questions I answered carefully back. Are you okay? I will be. They accepted that. Friends chose sides without meaning to. Some drifted toward him, drawn by his steadiness, his clarity, his quiet rebuilding. Others stayed with me, offering reassurance that separation is complicated, that rules matter, that intentions count. I listened to all of it. And for the first time, I didn't try to recruit anyone to my version of the story. Because the fallout wasn't about public opinion. It was internal. The real consequence wasn't losing my husband. It was losing the illusion that I could navigate relationships through implication and still be trusted. There were moments when resentment flared, brief, sharp, unwelcome. When I heard he was sleeping better. When I heard he'd been promoted. When someone said he looked healthier, a petty part of me wanted him to struggle, to regret, to reach out. He didn't. Instead, he built a life that didn't require explanation. That was his quiet power move. I started noticing the ripple effects of my choices in subtler ways. I caught myself hesitating before answering direct questions, then stopping, correcting course. I practiced saying what I meant instead of what would preserve comfort. When someone asked if I wanted something, I didn't say maybe to avoid deciding. I chose. The fallout reshaped my friendships too. People trusted me more when I stopped hedging. Conversations felt cleaner, less performative, less defended. And slowly, I realized something unsettling and relieving at the same time. Mark didn't ruin me by leaving. He revealed where I needed to grow. I ran into him once, unexpectedly, at a grocery store on a Sunday afternoon. We froze for half a second, two people recalibrating old instincts. He nodded politely. Hey, I replied. No tension, no longing, just acknowledgement. As he walked away, I felt a wave of something close to gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. Because the truth is, the fallout didn't punish him. It corrected me. Not in a vindictive way, in a precise one. The marriage didn't end because of separation rules. It ended because one of us treated honesty as optional, and the consequences of that choice didn't look like revenge. They looked like reality, a life that moved on without me at its center, a mirror that no longer distorted, a future that demanded I show up without loopholes. That was the fallout, and it was deserved. The ending didn't feel triumphant. It felt honest. Months after the divorce was finalized, my life settled into a shape that no longer required constant explanation. Mornings were quieter. Evenings were my own, not lonely, just unshared. I learned the difference. I didn't rush into dating, not out of punishment, but out of respect for myself and for the version of me I was trying to become. I stayed in therapy. I kept choosing clarity, even when it made conversations uncomfortable or forced decisions I used to avoid. Especially then. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the woman I was during that separation, the one who believed technical correctness could substitute for emotional honesty. I don't hate her. I understand her. She was afraid of choosing, afraid of being told no, afraid that committing clearly meant losing parts of herself she hadn't finished exploring. But fear doesn't make choices harmless. It just makes their consequences delayed. The lesson this story left me with isn't about rules or separation definitions or who is allowed to do what. It's this. If you need ambiguity to feel free, you're already avoiding something important. Love doesn't survive on loopholes. It survives on alignment, on two people choosing the same reality at the same time, even when it's inconvenient. Mark didn't leave because I broke a rule. He left because I broke trust and tried to intellectualize the fracture instead of honoring it. That distinction matters. To anyone listening who's standing in the gray area right now, half in, half out, hoping you can keep every door open without consequences, you can't. Every unasked question is still a choice. Every unclear answer still creates a truth. And the people who value integrity will walk away from ambiguity, not to punish you, but to protect themselves. I don't tell this story to shame myself. I tell it because growth doesn't always come from being wrong. Sometimes it comes from realizing you were technically right and still deeply misaligned with the kind of love you thought you wanted. Now, when I choose someone, or choose myself, I do it out loud. No footnotes, no loopholes, no silence pretending to be peace. That's the ending. Not perfect, but real.